When I was in elementary school, my prized possession was a purple iPod Nano, I think maybe third gen, not too sure. And on it was housed primarily the music that my parents had listened to and downloaded on iTunes, as well as most of the Guitar Hero 3 Legends of Rock soundtrack. I loved that thing, and within its 4 gigabytes of storage were the very foundations of my music taste, being the initial embers that would become the now great flame that is my love for music. Billy Joel, Black Sabbath, Counting Crows, Usher, Naughty by Nature, Jack Johnson. I would listen to pretty much anything that I could get my hands on. I had quite the eclectic taste for a 10-year-old. One of the all-time greats of the purple iPod Nano was Eminem, or at least 3 of his songs. The Real Slim Shady, Lose Yourself, and My Name Is. I would listen to those songs on repeat, over and over and over. If my iPod was a physical tape that could be worn out, then I would have done it 100 times over. Another thing that I would do ad infinitum is watch the previews of music videos on the iTunes store on the family computer that we kept in the kitchen. YouTube wasn't really a platform known to me at the time, and as a 4th grader, I didn't quite exactly have a disposable income to buy the music videos themselves, so I would just watch them on loop, the same 30-second snippet. Michael Jackson, Weird Al Yankovic, Eminem again. I could damn well mirror a very specific 30 seconds of the choreography of the When I'm Gone music video. I watched it that many times. What can I say? I liked Eminem. Anyways, my father one day had caught wind of my listening habits and decided to question me about it. Sure, he liked Eminem too, but should his 4th grade son really be listening to songs with lyrics such as "Tear this motherfucking roof off like 2 dogs caged"? So he asked me. And I was like, dude, what the heck are you talking about? That's not Eminem. I've never heard that in my life, man. You're talking crazy talk. Turns out that I had been listening to the clean versions of these songs the entire time. Whereas you may know, the clean versions of the songs typically omit most curse words. Growing up, I thought that the Will Smith line in The Real Slim Shady was actually bleeped. I thought that was the joke. That it was bleeped. So at some point I grew from boy to man and I crossed that bridge and I started listening to songs with the fuck word in them, uncensored. And it felt wrong. It felt like an uncanny mimic of the music that I had grown up with and come to love, with the curse words kind of crammed in there and forced and out of place. And so now, at the age of 23, whenever I happen to hear those songs for, whatever reason, I am instantly transported back to the time that I listened to the clean versions of those songs. Back to the time of my purple iPod Nano. And not just being that age and listening to the song, but having my headphones in, kicking up dust at the baseball fields, eating Ritz crackers in front of a crackling fireplace at Oglebay, waiting in the back of my mom's 2008 Chevy Suburban while everyone else is inside the gas station using the bathroom, because I swear that I didn't have to use the bathroom and then 20 minutes later I'm going to have to, and so now that's a whole thing. It's a way to transport back to those moments at the time seemingly innocuous but now meaning everything to me. I have spent more nights than I can count, or really care to admit, mulling over the almost mystical effect and chokehold that the concept, idea, emotion of nostalgia has on me. You could probably go so far as to say that I'm obsessed with it. And through my ponderings and musings on the matter, I have developed somewhat of a love-hate relationship with the idea. Because in my mind, nostalgia is one of those things in which its presence in your life directly correlates with the energy that you put into it, how much you feed into it. It spawns into your thought as a fleeting remembrance, maybe invoked by an all too familiar smell or a song that takes you back to your college days, but, without a conscious effort made to maintain its momentum and keep it in your mind, it putters out pretty easily. It goes away. You move on. You continue with your day. Its relevance to your everyday life hardly extends beyond those moments. But if you were anything like me, then those fleeting bursts of wistful recollection are key moments, opportunities to latch onto, vignettes of your past, taking time to passively observe them so you can later mold and shape them into romanticized abstractions of a life since past. And this habit of mine fluctuates in intensity and prevalence, but for the most part, and to some extent, always remains in my mind as this sort of recurring subject of personal debate, because honestly, I'm unsure of my own opinion on the matter. I view nostalgia as a chaotic yet neutral force of nature, human nature, really. The same way that weather, devoid of morality, can replenish or devastate our livelihoods, nostalgia can push itself into our thoughts as a force of comfort or as destruction. And I think that's where my point of contention with it begins. At what point do I draw the line and say that my indulgence in nostalgia in the abstract and in practice is more of a self-destructive habit than a beneficial one? At what point is it no longer a cheeky and poetic remembrance of good times and past emotion, and instead a toxic escape from present responsibility and current emotional turmoil? I don't know. And so even though this video acts as my way to discuss and inform on the matter, my process of making it does not begin with an answer, and instead this is sort of a ever-changing journey to reach it myself. I hope to find one as my work reaches its conclusion, and if this video comes out and you're watching it right now, then I think that it's safe to assume that I've reached some sort of conclusion. And this video is going to focus primarily on nostalgia acting through the vessel and within the context of music as an art form. Not exclusively focus on it, but that is kind of our main goal here. That's kind of what I do. I choose music because it seems to be the medium in which I experience nostalgia at the highest frequency and at the greatest intensity. This makes sense. Yeah, I mean, music is my entire life. I feel that this experience is also not really that unique to me either. The idea that music makes you recall memories is not a novel experience, and that's also a really big reason as to why I think it's such an important discussion to have. Music is one of the great connectors between barriers, whether it be culturally, linguistic, geographic, anything really. So I think it's wholly fair for me to assume that there are others out there experiencing similar situations and emotions that I do. I'm comfortable framing my thesis through this specific lens. Not to mention, this is a topic of pretty fucking massive scale, if I'm being honest. So I think that narrowing it down, with research going back decades, if not hundreds of years to this one facet of many, I think that's probably the smart move. This is nostalgia, music, and you.
So, what is nostalgia? I know that it may seem like a patronizing question that not only puts into question, but also insults the intelligence of the viewer, but come on, I've got to cover my bases here. Oxford's definition of it is, just to, lay our groundwork, is a sentimental longing or wistful affection for the past, typically for a period or place with happy personal associations. Now, I will not argue with Oxford's definition here. I'm not going to say that it's wrong, but I do think it's more of a starting point to expand upon. Because as I said earlier, despite nostalgia typically being associated with positive experiences, I do believe that it has the potential to be a destructive force as well. I want to observe real and relatable ramifications of this experience, but also observe how uplifting and emboldening that it can be as well. For me, nostalgia is a strong yet obscured force, hard to nail down and forever on the horizon line of our minds. Bryan S. Turner, an Australian sociologist, published a short paper titled A Note on Nostalgia in 1987, which observes the perspectives of nostalgia throughout history. Some viewing it as detrimental to the collective social consciousness, and some viewing it as morally virtuous and a sympathy and sensitivity to the human condition. There is a brief summary of the antiquated view that nostalgia lies within melancholy, which in pre-modern Europe was believed to be a medical affliction exclusive to intellectuals and artists, associated with an excess of black bile in the body, which of course we know now is completely fake. But I do think that the pre-modern medicine thought process behind the feeling is really interesting and worth talking about. The idea that such intense emotions and depressions were wholly physical doesn't really feel like too far-fetched of a conclusion to make to me, especially given the medical resources of the time. In a different yet tangential perspective, Plato, the philosopher, grouped in melancholy with sexuality and alcoholism, labeling them as fundamentally unreasonable conditions. She bounces on it in a way that is fundamentally unreasonable. But for the most part, the artists of the time associated it with black bile, one of the four humors, along with yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. And so even though we now know that the theory of the four humors is not factual at all, has no real basis on how our bodies function, and is a pretty archaic understanding of the human body, I do think that the idea that nostalgia and melancholy and depression is not only a mental affliction, but also a physical one is really interesting. In certain bouts of nostalgia, nostalgic feelings, nostalgic depressions, I mean, I personally have felt so depressed in the present that I long to be back in a romanticized past. I have 100% interpreted those emotions as physical responses, physical feelings. And you probably have too. It can make your body feel tight, uncomfortable, nauseous. I do not blame the artists of the time for assigning physical cause to their artistic blocks and intense bouts of depression. I've done the same thing. Turner states in his paper that his main focus and goal is to trace the evolution of nostalgia as a medical and moral label which produced the basis for a specifically sociological version of nostalgic metaphors in the late 19th century. This is not my goal. But I do think that his introduction of the idea that nostalgia is inherently anti-modernism is really interesting and can be applied to what we're talking about here, especially when it comes to our consumption of music. Turner refers to nostalgia as a byproduct of our awareness of our finite condition, awareness that we carry with us until our greatly thought about deaths. He links this to photography as a way of observing the passing of time. He specifically references a quote from Susan Sontag in her discussion of melancholic objects. She notes that photographs turn the past into an object of tender regard, scrambling moral distinctions and disarming historical judgments by the generalized pathos of looking at time past. Turner then quips that, in this case, the family photo album is essentially a portable graveyard. And this part of the paper really helped me make a lot of my more abstract thoughts a little more clear. Being the question, would nostalgia exist at all with the absence of lost, the greatest extreme example of such being death? I don't think so, at least not in the same way. For me personally, I am most wistful and nostalgic when my past circumstances seem to be better than my current ones. When I'm happy and thriving and making progress in different areas of my life, I feed into these thoughts way less and give them significantly less attention and relevance in my life. But in times of emotional turmoil, heavy anxiety, or great loss, I find it very difficult to keep these feelings out and push that yearning away. If now seems bad, I wish to have what I don't have anymore. So loss might be one of the great attractors of those feelings. When I'm looking back on those times, I'm really only looking back on what I no longer have. If I still had those things in some form, I wouldn't be looking back upon them and missing them because I still have them. Nostalgia at its core might be driven by desire, to have what I no longer have, to feel how I no longer feel, to be where I no longer am. And given that it is impossible to bring that back, to be back in that time, it lines up with Turner's idea that nostalgia is anti-modernism. He's talking about halting the progression of Western society, but let's get a little more local here. Replace greater society with individual emotions, and the same idea applies pretty well. Emotional and personal growth is halted by the inability to let go of that grasp and yearning for the past and look forward towards a more controllable future. Overindulgence in nostalgia clouds our present judgment. Another instance in which I am experiencing nostalgia at greater rates is when I'm not doing anything. In medieval Europe, monks were going through bouts of intense nostalgic depression, which they associated with spiritual dryness and a lack of social activity and routine. Finally, something I have in common with medieval monks. Why do we dive down rabbit holes late at night, listening to the music of our past, being so stuck in long-gone memories, repeating them over and over? What the fuck else is there to do? The monks found remedy in this problem by increasing prayer time and a ritualistic renewal of their religious vows, essentially reinforcing and affirming that they were okay and happy with their present circumstances and their present choices. Meditating on them, shutting off that nostalgia and depression. Finding meaning in their present social activity. But maybe it's just because I do not have the mental fortitude that a medieval monk has, but when I approach these circumstances, I find myself doing the exact opposite. When experiencing these spells of depression and nostalgia, I engage in activities that, instead of counteracting the emotions, channel and condense them, utilizing conduits to focus and strengthen the feelings and then feeding off of them. I'm talking about music. Music, an art form that I have many emotional and personal associations with, can act as a conduit for bouts of nostalgia, channeling them into condensed audible stimuli to produce an emotional response. It's why I rarely think of the baseball fields or road trips at random, but when I hear the clean version of The Real Slim Shady, I am immediately and without second thought transported back to that time in my life. Music is the stimuli, and my brain reacts. There is an insurmountable number of these signals because people react differently to different things. What might evoke nostalgia in me could be completely different for somebody else. It really is the five senses, but you can get as specific as you'd like. Some people taste vanilla and are back in middle school making homemade ice cream. My dad hears Shake Your Rump by the Beastie Boys and is back in his college days. I smell Fireball whiskey and am transported back to my sophomore year of college when I drank it but got drunk suspiciously fast and then woke up the next day with COVID. It's all personal. But for me, music is all the way at the top in terms of frequency and intensity of evoking these bouts of nostalgia. It is my greatest passion. You know how when you spend so much time with the ins and outs of something, observing, dissecting, and then rebuilding it to find its most consolidated and pure form, that in turn you sort of seek and desire validation in that effort, in that endeavor. That's what music is for me. It's everything that I love. It is an integral part of how I live. Another interesting read is in the form of Music-evoked Nostalgia, Affect, Memory, and Personality. As I've already sort of done here, one of the main points of the paper is to establish what kind of emotion nostalgia is. It is first asserted that the general consensus is that nostalgia has a positive effect on the mind, even counteracting sadness. This lines up with the belief that Turner had brought up in his paper, being that nostalgia was morally virtuous, a sensitivity to the human condition. It then later recognizes that nostalgia contains a bittersweet quality, mixing sadness with wistful joy. After the authors of this paper studied and researched other papers on nostalgia, they concluded that one of the primary goals of theirs was to establish an emotional profile of nostalgia and determined that it consisted of both positive and negative attributes, really being a case-by-case basis. I do believe that generally nostalgia does not lean in one particular direction more than the other, although the definition would suggest otherwise. I think that the context that you're experiencing it in and what memories are brought up by what songs all kind of factor into the equation here. As I said, I am most wistful when I'm listening to old music late at night when there's not really much else to do, but that's just me. An interesting but pretty expected finding of the paper was that a person's familiarity with a song is a major determining factor in whether or not it will make them feel nostalgic. They quote a study that found only 3% of songs rated unfamiliar by people still elicited an autobiographical memory in response. This is not surprising at all. Yeah, music we're familiar with is more likely to make us feel nostalgic. Of course, makes sense, but still, let's talk about it. They call these factors person-level constructs and context-level constructs. Person-level constructs being differences between person to person, such as personality, proneness to nostalgia, and temperament. And context-level constructs being mnemonic experience and context, being familiarity with the song, which memories are associated with the song, and which emotions are experienced. So if we view it from the perspective of the study, I can apply each categorization to myself and come to the conclusion that I must exhibit some sort of proneness to nostalgia through songs for some reason. I must line up with the factors that lead to intense reactions. I don't really want to suck all the emotion out of it and make it scientific, but I do think that these things are useful when observing why we have reactions to nostalgia. How prone to nostalgia am I? Do I have a predisposition for it? What songs are most likely to evoke the feeling? Adding in a factor from Turner's paper, how much free time do I have and how do I spend it? You know, like the monks. Maybe I'm just spiritually dry. I do appreciate how many other studies are cited in this paper. I think that it goes to show how personal of a connection we all have with the music that we listen to, and how the same song can be viewed two entirely different ways by two different people. It all comes down to personal experience. There's no clear cut and dry answer, no universal constant. They cite a study on how a predisposed mood can affect the reaction to the music we listen to, and they found that people that had a predisposed negative mood had a greater sensation of nostalgia than people in a positive or neutral one going into the experiment. They claim this lines up with the belief that nostalgia can be a remedy for sadness because the people going into the experiment with predisposed negative attitudes were alleviated of that sensation on exit. The important conclusion in this study is people with negative moods are more likely to experience nostalgia in this context. But I'm torn on it being a remedy for sadness, at least consistently. People talk about how listening to nostalgic music makes them feel better because there's comfort and relatability in the familiarity of the song. I hear this a lot, especially when it comes to sad nostalgic music as well. Many people believe that listening to sad music attached to negative periods of their life brings them comfort in some way, and I used to think the same, but now I'm not so sure. I call it comfort, but is it? Something to keep in mind is how these songs not only elicit different memories, but also the emotions attached to them. Sure, Only the Good Die Young by Billy Joel and Floating Away by Ninetales are both songs that make me nostalgic, but for two entirely different reasons about two entirely different periods of my life. The nostalgia that leads me down this path, peering into my childhood, and the music that defined it, doesn't really make me sad. I don't long to be back there, back in that position. Nor do I have any particularly bad memories associated with the time. It's more of like an affectionate observation. But when it comes to music that got me through a hard time, acted as musical crutches to lean on, it's a bit of a different experience. It's the same experience, being that I'm transported back to the time that song was most prevalent in my life, but what if that's a bad place to be? Sure, they were songs that at the time acted as relatable comfort and aided in escapism, but as time passed and I left the situation that I was in physically and emotionally, the purpose and utility of those songs sort of remains the same. So when I listen to them now, it's like I'm escaping a situation that I'm not even in anymore. I thought that the music I could project myself onto was aiding me in a time of need, so surely if I listen to it now, it will once again become a much needed source of comfort in trying times. But not really. It doesn't have the same effect anymore. I'm just taken back to the time that it did have that effect, and I don't want to be there anymore. I worked so hard to get out of it. It's like trying to force a mood. I have so much respect and love for the songs that defined that period of my life, but the nostalgia they create is almost too painful to experience. And I latch onto that, this toxic cycle of trying to fit an emotional square peg in a round hole, trying to fit into that feeling again. Like Sontag said about photography of the past, it scrambles moral distinction and disarms historical judgment. We lose sight of rational and logical thinking in favor of what we desire from our memories. But that's just talking about a group of songs from a specific time in my life. Is it unfair of me to take that visceral and specific feeling and use it as evidence to say that nostalgia can be as destructive as it can be helpful? Am I possibly biased in my conclusion that music-evoked nostalgia has a more negative impact on my life? Maybe I'm just focusing on the negative emotions habitually. They feel more intense and frequent because I dislike the experience more. Tons of studies have shown that we are more likely to retain and remember negative experiences more than positive ones. So I'm probably just more likely to experience negative nostalgia than positive nostalgia for that reason. In a study titled Nostalgia as a Resource for the Self, Matthew Van Ness and these other authors conducted experiments to find out whether or not nostalgia could be a positive resource for the self. Can one access positive self-attributes through exposure to nostalgia? Their hypothesis was, yes, that's the likely outcome. In the experiment, they had participants think about nostalgic events in their life or positive events to look forward to. They then filtered responses even further, having participants answer me or not me to a series of personality traits. This was to help assign common traits to people either in the nostalgia or future events categories to find correlation between the results. In the end, those in the nostalgia group exhibited a faster accessibility to positive attributes. They continued to do a couple more experiments that I don't really have time to explain, but in the end, their conclusion was that yes, experiencing nostalgia leads to a faster accessibility of positive attributes. So I have presented multiple studies that provide some pretty compelling evidence that within a margin of error, nostalgia acts as a remedy for sadness and is a generally positive emotion. So why do I have a hard time with that? Really? These studies all help support my idea that nostalgia could affect us positively and negatively depending on the context. So why do I feel frustrated? It's about what I'm missing, or what I think I am. It's this battle between rationality and romanticization. I know that these particular songs will take me back to a less desirable time of my life, but I almost long to be there because I can warp them and mold them to be seemingly less complicated or demanding than what I'm living now. But why do I choose music that romanticizes a troubled period of my life instead of happy music that I associate with positive experiences in my life? If I really desired escapism, why wouldn't I listen to music that takes me back to good times? What makes sad, nostalgic music more appealing as a crutch than happy music, at least to me? Well, when do you use a crutch? When you're injured. This is the part of the video where it becomes a bit of a Mad Libs type situation where I give a sentence missing some key phrases and you get to fill in the blanks with whatever your heart desires, so take this seriously. I say that because I have examples for this section that pertain to my experiences, but if you take out the key details and replace them with your own, the same point gets across while being a little bit more relatable to you. If I say, man, this Eminem song makes me happily remember that road trip, just fill in the blanks and replace those words and connect it to your experiences. It's, bada bing, bada boom. For this section, I would like to section my life into eras defined by two traits. One, I want to look at the time in my life and look at the average emotional state I was in. And two, I want to just observe the music that I was listening to at the time. I have sort of mentally assigned groups of music to pockets of time in my life that I most closely associate the music with. That's not really too deep of a concept. I'm just saying that I associate the music with the time in my life that I listen to it the most. Simple enough. I associate a lot of older rock and metal like Black Sabbath, Heart, and The Strokes with elementary school and middle school because at the time I was playing a lot of Guitar Hero 3 Legends of Rock on my Wii. So the repetition of hearing those songs through that game cemented them into that specific period of my life. Playing after school, buying the live version of Paranoid on iTunes because I didn't really know the difference. I hear Raining Blood by Slayer and I am just back in 5th grade in front of that TV. I'm very nostalgic for those tracks, and I enjoy them in a much different way than I do the rest of the artist's discography. At the time, I was listening to them just because I thought they were badass and they were in a video game that I liked, but over time, the mental feeling that I have assigned to them has changed. Now, I think I'm comforted by those songs more than anything else. Moving forward to middle school and high school, I'm now experiencing the intentional discovery and individual discovery of music for the first time. Essentially, for the first time, obtaining music through sources outside of my household, outside of my family, with the sole intention of finding new music. Guitar Hero 3 had a great soundtrack, but it was a video game first. I was very attracted to the emo and pop punk bands of the time that were kind of entering their twilight years and sort of crossing the horizon over to becoming legacy projects. By the time I got my grubby little mitts on bands like Green Day, Blink-182, and My Chemical Romance, they were entering a quieter era of their careers. They were bands that other people were already starting to become nostalgic for when I was first discovering them. What these bands helped me discover for the first time was that music can be emotionally utilitarian, that can aid in solving problems, a tool to fix things. Up until then, I really listened to the music that I did because it was good and it sounded cool and I liked listening to it, and that was pretty much it. But now I was building emotional connections with the music that I listened to, the ability to project myself onto the song and have those feelings bounce back to me, reshaped by the art form. I felt seen in that regard, comforted by this raw and visceral art that let me know that I wasn't alone in the world. I would just loop 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge until it filled in the gaps of my cracked, developing psyche, torturing my family with the Black Parade on the Sunday morning car ride to church every week. And given a lot of negative major shifts happened in my life around that time, it took hold a lot easier, and it became a form of escapism. This concept was realized to its fullest potential during my last half of high school, kind of entering this new era of agency and autonomy that I had developed for myself. And with that, a growing sensitivity and awareness to my ever-shifting emotional state. I had finally developed the cognizance to understand how my actions reflected my emotions. There was, to some extent, some level of new critical thinking that went into wondering why I felt the way that I did. I was depressed. And as if the universe responded to that affliction, I was innocuously introduced to a music scene that would change the trajectory of my life going forward. Songs that were just so raw and visceral and personal and direct by artists with new, small audience. It all felt tailor-made just for me. A then booming underground scene with artists like Lil Peep, Ninetales, Garden, Shinigami, 93 Feet of Smoke, artists around my age making songs about the way that I felt. This era of my life falls under that aforementioned group of music whose use to me has changed over time. How I view it has shifted. My point here is that this is how nostalgia differs and how it can take many forms and shapes in the music that we listen to. I have decided to develop my own nomenclature for these varieties of nostalgia, and I sure would love to tell you about them. Ignoring that entire spiel for just a moment, let's observe the pop music, the popular music that came out when I was in high school, when my parents were in high school, when my grandparents were in high school. Music we never really chose to listen to, but were exposed to over time for various reasons. Radio, restaurant, retail. There's tons of environments in which we listen to music with it not really being an active decision to do so. We're nostalgic for that specific music of that time because that's what played at the mall or in high school. Thunderstruck by AC/DC and Power by Kanye West are two songs that I cannot take seriously whatsoever because Marshall University, the college that I attended, played them at every single sporting event for 10 years straight. Association is a powerful thing, and through repeated exposure and then retention of that exposure, we form really powerful associations with music that we hear. Memories. My grandparents liked Elvis and Sinatra. My parents like Pearl Jam and Pepper. There's strong associations and memories connected to the music that we grow up with. You know, it takes them back. To apply my own label to this kind of enjoyment, I will refer to this as legacy nostalgia, which I will loosely define as nostalgia that is attached to music through the simple means of repeated exposure over time. And I think that this is where music-evoked nostalgia best functions as a remedy for sadness, as positive attribute inducing, because the lyrical and emotional context of the songs can kind of be arbitrary. When I think of artists like Black Sabbath, Billy Joel, Jack Johnson, Eminem, there's not really a lot of thematic things for me to tie together between those artists, other than the fact that I just listened to them all growing up, and they're all associated with that era of my life. So my association with them is less tied to a specific emotional state or mood, and more so just with adolescence in general. Listening to them today feels like a much more sterile and simplified experience. The other form of music-evoked nostalgia that I will name, I will call experience nostalgia. Music that has acted as a sort of emotional companion to specific experiences in somebody's life. Not to say that legacy nostalgia isn't emotional, because it certainly is, but I think it's less tied to specific emotional experience. But I guess that really depends on what emotions you assign to which memories and how intense they are. Everybody's different. Experience nostalgia is most strongly defined by the specific emotional experiences and the reaction to the recollection of them. This could be songs that got you through a breakup, accompanied you on a road trip, even sex playlists. Songs that evoke a strong nostalgic reaction parallel to the formative experience with the song. This goes back to how music, once emotionally utilitarian, can grow to become difficult to listen to due to the associated experiences it first became useful for in the first place. I have friends that hate listening to songs that in a vacuum they enjoy, but over time they have grown to associate them with painful past experiences such as, ex-partners and such. So now there's some sort of sour taste involved on consumption. But that's still nostalgia, is it not? Even if that recollection is painful and the association can be kind of negative over time, that's still places that we can sometimes long to be back at, right? We can view them wistfully. I know that I'm essentially attempting to redefine what nostalgia means, but these things matter to me and I think they apply. When I listen to old Ninetales or Ray Brown songs, I can essentially look around and see the dimly lit walls of my dorm room 3 a.m. trying to finish up assignments that are due that day. It is a powerful feeling, and I'm conflicted on how I feel about it, how I feel about my occasional welcoming of it, and whether or not it's detrimental or not. In 2013, Ben Greenman wrote one of my favorite music articles ever about Jason Molina, published about a week after his untimely passing. I'm kind of shoehorning this in because the article is not about nostalgia, but it does briefly bring it up, so I'm using it as an excuse to talk about it. Jason Molina is one of my favorite artists ever for a load of reasons that I don't really have time to get into now. But if you like his music, then I highly recommend checking out this write-up. There is a passage in it that I feel strongly about and I feel sort of applies to what I'm talking about here, so we're going to talk about it. Here it is. The online tributes to Molina focused on his talent for coming clean about just how weary he was and how he was less and less able, over time, to find solace in the prospect of love or hope or even personal equilibrium, but he was often able to find solace in art. I once wrote a review that called his work sepia-toned, which made some sense as a synesthesia but none as an idea. His work never made me feel especially comfortable, which is how I knew it wasn't nostalgic. Maybe within Greenman's anger at Molina's death is my answer, because I once again found myself disagreeing with the idea that nostalgia was innately or exclusively a positive emotion. Nostalgia can be bitter and painful. I kept hammering that objection and over and over and over again. I'm being stubborn here. I find comfort in Molina's work. Within this musical wilderness of bleak, decrepit, decaying emotions, I found myself in them, and I found comfort in that. As hopeless as his work was, it was comfortable to me because I saw myself in it. And there it was. Maybe that painful recollection is positive. It's productive. I always assumed that it held you back, keeping you reliving past experiences and being detrimental for doing so. But without those experiences, I wouldn't be who I am now, and I like who I am now. I wouldn't know what I know. So as painful as those experiences were, and as bittersweet as the music I listened to then is now, is a part of me thankful for those experiences and the music that kept me getting through them because they shaped and are a part of who I am now, part of who I am as a person. And in turn, does it make that listening experience that I have aligned up with nostalgia a positive one? Yeah, I think so. But I need more opinions. This is an incredibly informal study, so I'm not going to try to make any definitive or objective claims here. I can recognize that this isn't really how most experiments go, but I wanted to gather information from other people and see what memories and experiences they associated with music and nostalgia and see how much it aligned or didn't align with my thoughts on it. I sent out a survey to my Discord and then also posted the link on social media. I admittedly could not get that large of a sample size, so a big thumbs down to all of you that saw that link and did not click it. But whatever, let's talk about it anyways. I asked a short list of questions of nostalgic and emotional responses to music and in which context they were experienced. The answers are anonymous though, so the person and context level constructs that we discussed earlier aren't really going to play into this as factors. The questions are as follows. When you feel nostalgic, what is the emotional response? When feeling intense emotions such as euphoria or depression, does music enhance them? When listening to songs from your adolescence, how do you feel? When listening to music associated with negative experiences, do you feel better, worse, or experience no change? When listening to music associated with positive experiences, do you feel better, worse, or no change? What are some songs that make you nostalgic? That last question doesn't really actually help me reach a conclusion. I just kind of wanted to know what songs people were nostalgic for. The first question, asking for the initial emotional response to the concept and idea of nostalgia, came out to 59% mostly positive and 26% very positive. So a total of 85% of people reporting some sort of positive reaction to the concept of nostalgia. This is about what I expected. Honestly, I would even say that I might have expected it to be a bit higher. But it does show that a small amount of people don't immediately associate nostalgia with its assigned innately positive definition, with 11% of people feeling mostly negative about it and 4% of people being neutral. Nobody, however, feeling very negative initially about the idea. Generally, nostalgia is a positive and affectionate emotion. This continues to further perpetuate that idea, but it shows that it's not exclusively so in some people's minds. The next question also had some pretty expected results, with 97% of people reporting that any strong emotions that they were feeling are enhanced by music, with 66.7% of people saying that it happens every single time. Music is an expression and communication full of nuanced emotions and multifaceted mental states, and I feel like it's such an emotional labor to create and listen at some point, so I find it hard to believe that some people's strong emotions aren't enhanced by it at all, but 3% report just that. 59% of people reported a happy, affectionate response to listening to songs from their adolescence. This is also the group that I fall in, tying in earlier with how I talked about legacy nostalgia and how I consumed music as a kid. I don't really have a lot of strong emotions tied up into those songs, so it's a bit easier for me to have a overall positive experience with them. And the 14.8 of neutral reactions reported really plays into the idea of legacy nostalgia, because it's showing that this is music that I just associate with a time period, no strong emotional connection, moving on. But I do understand the 25.9% of participants who reported a sad, wistful reaction to it. There could be 100, 1,000 different reasons as to why music from somebody's adolescence can be difficult to listen to, whether it be through negative experience or a strong longing to be back to that simplified way of life. In the romanticized abstract, childhood is straightforward and simple, generally lacking adult responsibility. The music that we listened to during then could really depict any emotion, but it will take us back to that time nonetheless. It's less about the content of the music and more about the context of it. The next two charts go hand in hand here, and I think provide the most compelling information and findings of my little study. 55.6% of participants reported feeling worse after listening to music associated with negative experiences in their life, but a whopping 92.6% reported feeling better after listening to music associated with positive experiences of their life. This is pretty huge to me. I feel like such a wide gap in responses reflects what I've been trying to articulate about how nostalgic music can affect us over time, especially when it comes to nostalgic music that we associate with negative experiences. 3.7% of people felt worse listening to positive experience music, but 25.9% of people felt better listening to negative experience music. Now, obviously, I don't know the lyrical and emotional content of the songs listened to by the people that reported this result, but what I do think that it points towards is that we are much more likely to have negative experience music be therapeutic and comforting than positive experience music be detrimental to us overall. It is hard to do anything alone, and the older I get, the more that I realize the refusal of offered support is wildly counterintuitive and in no way facilitates healing. But I feel that in my present moments of weakness, even when I feel like I cannot turn to anybody, the music from my past, the music that got me through the troubles of my past, can remind me of the times that I've already overcome and conquered. So even if listening to those songs does, in a way, take me back to those times, I kind of get to view them from an outside perspective. Music and nostalgia combining can help me be reflective and understand what I can be going forward. And that is why music is so powerful, and why the nostalgia associated with it can be this untamed force of nature. We cannot control it, but we can observe it. We can react to it. It doesn't really have to be one way or the other, positive or negative. And I think when I started this research, I was so focused on trying to prove that it could be anything that I kind of lost focus on what it was to me. Someone once told me that no matter what happens to you, no matter what anybody does to you, you are in charge of how you react. And I thought that that was so unfair. Like, if somebody wrongs me, shouldn't they take accountability and responsibility for what they've done to me, for how I feel? But I can't make somebody accountable, especially if they don't want to be, but I can choose how I react. Music tends to be greater than the sum of its parts, in my mind acting as a conduit for messy and abstract emotions, channeling them into something tangible. It can be a window, giving us a fresh observation of where we've been and where we are headed. In my video about COVID bars, I talked about how music is by nature archival. It excels in the preservation of history, culture, and emotions. In this case, the consumption of music can do that as well. First, the artist putting the emotions into the song, and through our repeated exposure and retention of it, our emotions are preserved. As time passes and we grow and experience new things, these conduits can capture our emotions and the times we were at, and they become, over time, as Susan Sontag has put it, objects of tender regard. Even if nostalgic music evokes these mosaics of bittersweet memory and jagged relivings of our lowest moments, we get to view these and observe these moments through the load-bearing filter of the art that got us through it. In that endeavor to understand now what we didn't then, I find it imperative to make an important distinction, being that although nostalgia is typically affectionate but with a bleak capacity to be destructive, we should always respect ourselves enough to look forward in spite of our circumstances. Music should be a time capsule, not a time machine. In the end, I have, if anything, reinforced the comfort that I receive from the music of my past, but with a new cognizance knowing not to lean on what I cannot go back to. I had kind of hoped that my conclusion would be a bit more concrete, a little bit more profound, but we are messy and uncertain, and we long for ease of mind. Music can provide that ease of mind. Connecting us to our past and showing us glimpses of our future, music can provide that. So I will graciously and cautiously accept it.